I ask everyone to think back to last summer and fall. Record-breaking wildfires exploded across the West. These were areas that we recreate in, have cherished memories from, or maybe even areas we grew up in. News headlines consistently read things like, record-breaking wildfire, and the age of the megafire is here. Yet on the news, we often only hear about the societal impacts, and we don't hear much about the ecological impacts of these fires. My name is Ashley Woolman, and my thesis focuses on recent wildfires in the Southwest and the extent of forest loss in ponderosa pine forests since 1995. Historical ponderosa pine forests are characteristically known for their open and park-like structure with an understory of grasses and forbs. This was maintained by frequent low-severity fires that occurred every 2 to 20 years. We know this from historical records, such as studying annual tree growth rings and fire scars on tree samples. Ponderosa pine has a very thick bark that can tolerate fire, and because of that, a series of fire scars can appear. It's relatively straightforward to know when the fires occurred and to develop a fire return interval map just by counting tree rings. When we look at these fire scars, we can learn quite a bit about historical fire regimes. Now, this figure on the right was taken from a study that looked at fire scars across all of western United States and shows sites recording fire scars in the past 1,000 years. Each red dot there represents a fire scar, and this is looking at a time period from about 1100 AD to the year 2000. And if you sit back and look at it, you notice that from around 1900 on, in many of these environments, there's a lack of fire relative to where historical fires would have occurred. This is attributed to a century of fire management focused on fire suppression. Fire suppression, combined with other land management practices, including livestock grazing and harvesting large trees, has led to a forest structure considerably different from historical conditions. In the far left photo, you see the widely spaced or open ponderosa pine forests that were maintained by frequent low-severity fire regimes. Without frequent fire, these forests have become increasingly dense, consisting of many small-diameter trees, fuels extending up into the tree crowns, and increases in surface fuels, as you can see in the far right photo. These forest conditions, combined with longer drought periods, have led to longer fire seasons and increases in the extent of high-severity fire in these forests. And that brings me to my thesis. My objectives were to first assess the recent patterns of wildfire in ponderosa pine forests and the relationships between burn severity and tree mortality. Second, to quantify the regional trends in ponderosa pine forests, such as losses or gains with and without fire, and to characterize changes in vegetation composition post-fire. For a brief overview of my methods, my data came from two sources. The first, I used data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Nationwide Program, otherwise known as FIA, which is maintained by the U.S. Forest Service. This program has one permanent plot approximately every 6,000 acres, spread across all land ownerships and forest types in the United States. I used tree, seedling, and understory vegetation data. Next, to characterize recent fires across the Southwest and their burn severity, raster grids of two fire severity metrics were crossed with exact FIA plot locations to obtain a fire severity rating for each plot. The fire severity metric I'll focus on in this presentation is called the Modeled Composite Burn Index, or CBI. I ended up with a total of 685 plots, which are the black dots on this map, spread across Arizona and New Mexico. They were sampled 3 times between 1995 and 2018. Of those plots, only 175 of them burned within my sample period, and the fire perimeters of those fires are in red. During my plot selection process, the most important criteria was that plots had to contain at least one live ponderosa pine seedling, sapling, or tree in at least one of the 3 sample periods. So now for some results. Only about 26% of my plots burned since 1995. There were a total of 88 fires that crossed these plots, and the graph shows that there was a lot of variation in fire severity. On the x-axis is fire severity as the metric I mentioned earlier, modeled CBI, and on the far left are low severity values in yellow and high severity values in red on the right. The y-axis is the proportion of burned plots, and this shows that more than half of my plots burned at moderate to high severity, which is considerably different from historical conditions. But what is more alarming is that 74% of my plots have not experienced any fire since 1995. In looking at the relationship between fire severity and tree mortality, I broke up all of the trees within my study into 3 size classes: small, medium, and large. I found fire severity was a significant predictor of tree mortality among each size class. This figure shows burn severity on the x-axis again, and the predicted survival on the y-axis. This tells us that there is an approximate fire severity threshold at 1.7, which is moderate severity, in which each size class of ponderosa pines are not expected to survive a wildfire. In looking at the mortality trends over time, I found ponderosa pine trees declined by 21% across my study area since 1995. This is mostly driven by burned plots, which are orange in this figure, and trees in burned plots decreased by 46%. Most of this loss was from small diameter trees on the left. I also found that 11% of plots suffered 100% ponderosa pine mortality, in contrast to only 1% of plots that didn't contain any ponderosa pine in the first inventory sample, but did by 2018. So we know that ponderosa pine trees are declining, but what is taking their place? This figure shows changes in vegetation only in the plots that burned. While it looks confusing at first, I am going to walk you through it. There are 3 vegetation types: ponderosa pine forest in blue, forest lacking ponderosa pine in green, and non-forest in red. And if you look closely, there are arrows and flat ends in this figure. The flat ends are what the vegetation was in the first inventory around 1995, and the arrows show what the plot transitioned to post-fire. The link widths are proportional to the number of plots showing such change. While there's a lot of variation among these transitions, and many stayed the same, 28% of plots transitioned to types containing no ponderosa pine in either the green or red colors. And the most considerable amount, 17%, transitioned to non-forest or oak shrublands. And if we look at how fire has influenced these transitions, with fire severity on the x-axis again, we can see that shifts to non-forest vegetation occurs mostly in moderate to high severity fire, there in the red and green, whereas plots that sustain ponderosa pine burn mostly at low severity. Yet you may be wondering how long these conditions will persist, and that do these fire-induced conversions away from ponderosa pine forests represent permanent changes, or are they just successional stages? Right now, we don't have a lot of examples to know whether or not these forests will loop back to a ponderosa pine forest. But my results point toward 2 key themes for land management if we wish to retain these forests into the future. Number 1, we need to reintroduce historic fire regimes. We really need to do this in our overly dense forests, but also in the early successional stages instead of suppressing fires. This can be prescribed burns and/or allowing natural fires to burn under the right climate conditions. Mechanical treatments, such as thinning, are also vastly needed to reduce fuels prior to reintroducing these fires. Second, we need to hold on to the large trees we have. They are critical for regeneration and preserving this species into the future. Most importantly, both of these are needed at large spatial scales. My data suggests that the current pace and scale of fuel reduction treatments in the Southwest is not working. Land managers need to collaborate across jurisdictions for landscape scale collaboration. In an era of complex environmental change, this research contributes to an emerging ecological understanding of forest vulnerability to fire-driven conversions. This research will inform regional and local land management efforts in the Southwest to sustain these valued forests. There are many people I would like to acknowledge for their support in this project, including Dr. Jonathan Koop, my advisor, and the rest of my committee members, Jenny DeMarco and John Shaw, as well as thank you to Sean Parks and Zach Treisman for their help, and of course my friends and family. Thank you for your time, and I now welcome any questions.